We are going to do two things today, bringing in something that we've been studying separately from social studies, as well as looking a little bit closer at the Constitution. The part that we're going to bring in on top of the Constitution is the idea of nonfiction text structure. Remember, nonfiction means it is totally limited to facts. Fiction can have things in there that aren't facts, but nonfiction may not have anything but facts. So we're looking at our nonfiction text structure, the way it's put together, its organization. In the parts that we look at today, the text structure is going to be one of two approaches, one of two organizations. Some of the parts that we look at are going to tell you the steps in order. What have we called that text structure? We've called it a couple of things. We've called it a chronology or chronological order. We've also called it sequence. The other type of nonfiction text structure that we're going to run into in these paragraphs today is comparing and contrasting. What does it mean if a text compares two ideas? What does it mean if a text contrasts two ideas? Well, if a text compares the two ideas, it's telling you ways that they are similar. If it contrasts the two ideas, it's telling you ways those ideas are different. So, keep in mind, every so often we are going to stop and decide if the text is showing sequence or comparing and contrasting. So, I am going to tuck that right here off to the side. We are not going to look at every single paragraph either. If you want to get your social studies book to read along, that's perfectly fine, but I will also be showing the text here on the screen, so whatever is easiest for you. I'm on page 358. 358 is where I'm starting. And I'm going to start with this second paragraph under the heading of the big picture. In our social studies book, whenever they tell you the big picture, they're trying to show where a particular lesson fits in. Hopefully you understand how this lesson fits with what has gone before, because so far we've been talking about the way the Constitution sets up the government in three different branches, splitting apart the powers. And then we talked about the preamble, the introduction to the Constitution. So it should be pretty obvious how this fits in. Now that the Constitution has been written, next step. So this first paragraph, I am going to stop after this first paragraph, and you will have to think about whether this is showing sequence or compare and contrast. The approval of 9 states, 2/3 of the 13 states, was needed before the Constitution could go into effect, before it became a law. Up until 9 states agreed to the Constitution, it was just a suggestion. So in order to do that, in order to get the approval, each of the states held a convention to decide whether or not to ratify. What does ratify mean? Well, these commas tell you your definition is right here. Officially approve the Constitution. So is this paragraph showing you two ideas and how they're similar and different, or is it telling you some steps? Well, if it's telling you steps, it should be telling you what is going to get done. That would be ratifying the Constitution. What are the steps to get that done? 9 states approve. Before that step, all of the states have to hold a convention. All of the states have to decide whether or not to ratify. When 9 states say, yep, we officially approve the Constitution, it has been ratified. So this is a sequence. This tells you 4 different steps that it took for the Constitution to be ratified. Now the next paragraph. Is this another sequence, or is this comparing and contrasting? The responses of citizens varied. That means they were different. Ooh, that should be a big hint. The idea of a central government troubled people. Many, like Amos Singletary, worried that the states would lose their rights. Others, like Robert Livingston, felt that the new country's problems could be solved only by a strong central government. The debates over the Constitution had begun. So how are these in order? Well, it doesn't really tell any steps. It's not like these are the steps that it took for everybody to debate the Constitution. Does it split them into groups? Yeah. It talks about the people who are troubled by a central government and the people who think a central government will solve the country's problems. And these are all the responses of citizens to the Constitution. So this paragraph is comparing and contrasting. We're going to move over to 359. Again, we won't be reading the whole page. We're just going to read the section that talks about Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So this, if you try to decide already, is it going to be a sequence nonfiction structure, or is it going to compare and contrast? Well, in order for sequence, you have to have something be the end goal. For compare and contrast, you need two groups. This heading is talking about two different ideas, two different groups. Doesn't really tell what they want, it just talks about two different groups. So to me, is that going to be sequence or compare and contrast? Hopefully you said compare and contrast. So now we'll read the rest of these paragraphs and see if it still fits that text structure. Supporters of the Constitution were called Federalists because the Constitution called for a federal system of government. Opponents, people who didn't want it, like Virginia's Patrick Henry, were called Anti-Federalists. Henry was afraid the states would lose their freedom under the Constitution. Liberty, Henry said, give us that precious jewel and you may take everything else. You might remember Patrick Henry. Earlier, he made another famous comment about liberty. He is the fellow who said, give me liberty or give me death. So this idea of liberty was very important to Patrick Henry. And so Patrick Henry is against this strong government over the whole United States because he is afraid it is going to take away the liberty of individual citizens. The supporters, the people who were Federalists, it didn't say very much about them yet. It's definitely setting up a contrast, though. What do they have in common? Well, they're all talking about the Constitution. They're all talking about a system of government. Let's see if the next couple of paragraphs do more to compare or contrast. The Federalists, well, right there's your biggest hint. Up here it talked mostly about the Anti-Federalists with Patrick Henry. Now it's going to talk about the other group. First of all, it's going to give you some names. They included such people as Edmund Pendleton of Virginia, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. Just like Patrick Henry had a quote about the Constitution, here is Edmund Pendleton's opinion of the Constitution. There is no quarrel argument between government and liberty, Pendleton said. Yet anti-federalists, okay, now we get back to the people like Patrick Henry, like Massachusetts writer Mercy Otis Warren, here's another one that's on Patrick Henry's side, they were not convinced. So Federalists think a strong government can protect individual liberty. The Anti-Federalists did not. So they saw efforts to ratify the Constitution as dark, secret plots of men who were growing rich while lovers of freedom suffered. So these two paragraphs are very much comparing, but even more contrasting, the opinions of the Federalists who wanted the Constitution and a strong central government to fix the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, and the Anti-Federalists who wanted most to protect individual liberty and thought it was very important that any governmental document had to be clear that individual liberty was not being taken away, even while a strong central government was set up. Sequence? Not so much. This is a back and forth argument between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So it's comparing and contrasting. The next 2 pages, we're going to go all the way through this so that you can see if these pages show you sequence or compare and contrast. Remember, sequence is going to be order. And if you look at the title, you are either going to look for ways things in the Bill of Rights are similar and ways that they are different, or the steps that were involved to get the Bill of Rights. By January 9th, 1785, 5 states, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut, had already ratified the Constitution. That sounds like a step. Only 4 more states were needed to approve it. And that would be the next step. But then, before that step, debate heated up. People started arguing. The process slowed down. So if you're talking about a process, that's another good hint that you're talking about steps, the order something happened. Is that sequence or compare and contrast? There is no Declaration of Rights. This sounds like something Patrick Henry would say. The Anti-Federalists complained that the Constitution did not contain a Bill of Rights. A Bill of Rights is a document that describes the basic rights of the people. It also says that the government cannot take away these rights. Some people called this document a Declaration of Rights because it contained rights that were listed in the Declaration of Independence. Almost every state constitution included a Bill of Rights. In 1776, George Mason wrote this country's first Bill of Rights as part of Virginia's Constitution. He based it partly on an English Bill of Rights that had been written almost 100 years earlier. Does it seem like it's telling some steps? Could we pull out these steps and put them together on a timeline? Say, this happened first, this happened, then this happened. If it is that sequence or compare and contrast? Mason felt strongly that the United States Constitution should also have a Bill of Rights. He agreed with Patrick Henry. When it was his turn to sign the United States Constitution, Mason refused. Remember, these are the same types of men. If some of them are exactly the same men, some of them were friends with the men who wrote and signed the Declaration of Independence and who had their livelihood and their families taken away from them as a result. So to the people signing these documents or not signing them, it's very important to their character. It's what it says about what they believe. And George Mason believed it was more important to have a Bill of Rights than for him to sign the United States Constitution. When he didn't sign it, his reason that he said, there is no Declaration of Rights. Next step, as the delegates gathered in Boston, Massachusetts, to debate ratifying the Constitution, many in Massachusetts took up Mason's cry. So Mason had already said this when he refused to sign the Constitution. After that step, now we have people in Massachusetts who are saying it's not a good idea. The Federalists said that the Massachusetts Constitution already had a Bill of Rights. The Anti-Federalists felt this was not enough. They also wanted a Bill of Rights added to the United States Constitution. Here's why. Remember, they were talking about a constitution that set up a government for the whole United States. This idea of a federal system of government. And people in individual states wanted to make sure that the government that was over all the states was kept in control by realizing that it too had to promise not to take away individual rights of people. John Hancock, remember him? He signed the Declaration of Independence. He was the first one that signed it. He had become the governor of Massachusetts. He told the delegates that a Bill of Rights could be added to the United States Constitution as amendments. Amendments mean changes, additions. So John Hancock wanted the Constitution, but he realized also it was very important that any document that set up a government for the whole United States had to be clear that the government of the whole United States did not take away the rights of individual citizens. And so he wanted a Bill of Rights in the Constitution, but his point is we can add that. This promise persuaded the Massachusetts delegates to ratify the Constitution. Other states followed Massachusetts. Is this compare and contrast? Here's how they're the same, here's how they're different, or is this the next step? Other states followed Massachusetts. On June 21, 1789, New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify the document. Now the Constitution was law. By 1790, all 13 states had ratified it. A year later, Congress added the 10 amendments to the Constitution that are known as the Bill of Rights. Why? That was the only way approximately 4 of the states, the ones needed to ratify the Constitution, would ratify it. Only if there was the promise that there would be a Bill of Rights. So the next year, after the Constitution became the way of setting up government in the United States, the Bill of Rights was added. Adding the Bill of Rights to the Constitution was possible because the Constitution included rules for adding amendments. George Mason had realized that people might want to change the Constitution. Are we continuing in this series of steps in this chronology? No, we've kind of gone back before these steps to when the Constitution was written. Just because we've flashed back before the events it was talking, does that mean it's not a sequence? No. You just have to pay attention in the sequence for clues about when there might be flashbacks. It was possible because the Constitution included rules. George Mason had realized this is past tense. That means before the Constitution was ratified, these ways of making changes to it had been written in. So if you were putting all of these events on a timeline, this would be the first one. George Mason puts into the Constitution rules for adding amendments. Here's what he said when he put in those rules. It will be better to provide for amendments than to trust to chance and violence. So by giving people in the United States a way to change the way their government is set up, that will keep the government from taking over the rights and from being able to respond to changes. However, the writers of the Constitution did not want people to be able to change it without serious debate. So if the Constitution got changed, they did want to make sure that most citizens of the United States agreed that the Constitution should be changed. Before states can vote on an amendment, it must be approved by 2/3 of both the Senate and the House of Representatives. So this sounds like we're starting a sequence. This is not the sequence of getting the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. This sequence is how you would change the Constitution. So they've changed the main idea here, but it's still a sequence structure of the text. Before states can vote on an amendment, it must be approved by 2/3 of both the Senate and the House of Representatives. Or 2/3 of the states can request that Congress call a special convention. Then 3/4 of all the states must ratify an amendment before it becomes part of the Constitution. So it is a very difficult and time-consuming process to amend the United States Constitution, but it is possible. Since the Bill of Rights was added in 1791, some 10,000 amendments to the Constitution have been proposed. That means they've been suggested. Only 17 have been added. You can read about them back on R37 to 45 if you want to. The next thing we are going to do, we're going to spend several, almost weeks, focusing on what rights are promised to citizens of the United States that the government can't take away from them. What rights are promised in the Bill of Rights. So that is where we are headed. Hopefully you also saw today how thinking about the structure of the text, the way it's organized, can help you pick out the important parts and ignore the less important parts when you have a really dense gathering of information and facts. Just watching this video is your assignment for today, although I would strongly suggest taking some time to study the preamble to the Constitution as well.